I arrived at my son David's prestigious law school reception wearing casual clothes after spending 12 hours in federal court. The security guard at the main entrance took one look at my simple blouse and comfortable shoes, then pointed toward a side door. "Catering staff this way," he said without question. Before I could respond, another worker handed me an apron and directed me to the kitchen. Through the serving window, I watched affluent parents in designer suits mingling in the main reception hall. I decided not to correct their assumption. Sometimes you learn the most about people when they think nobody important is watching. That choice would change everything. I found myself in the bustling kitchen alongside the real catering staff, observing a world I had never seen from this angle. Margaret, the kitchen supervisor, welcomed me with genuine warmth. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. "First time working one of these fancy university events?" she asked while arranging appetizers on silver platters. I nodded, not wanting to lie outright, but curious to see how the evening would unfold. Margaret began sharing stories about her life, how she worked 3 different catering jobs to support her 2 children, both honor students dreaming of college they might never afford. "The irony is," she said with a bitter laugh, "I have a master's degree in education, but these jobs pay better than substitute teaching. Benefits, too, when you can string enough hours together." Through the serving window, I watched my son, David, nervously adjusting his tie as he introduced his girlfriend, Emma, to his classmates. Emma Sterling was everything David had described, poised, elegant, with the kind of natural confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. Her father, Richard Sterling, commanded attention in the center of the room, regaling other parents with stories about his real estate empire. I carried a tray of hors d'oeuvres into the main reception area, moving invisibly among the guests. The conversations I overheard painted a clear picture of Emma's background. The Sterling family owned commercial properties across 3 states, had a summer home in the Hamptons, and traced their lineage back to the Mayflower. These were details David had mentioned, but seeing the family's wealth displayed so casually felt different. "So David," I heard one of his classmates say, "Tell us about your family. What does your father do?" My son's face tightened slightly. "My parents are divorced. My father isn't really in the picture." "What about your mother then?" David glanced around nervously, his eyes briefly meeting mine before looking away without recognition. "She works in government. Nothing too exciting." The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. I had spent 20 years building my career from nothing, working night shifts as a court clerk while attending law school, raising David alone after his father abandoned us when he was 3 years old. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night studying for the bar exam while David slept in the next room, every meal I skipped to pay for his school supplies, all of it reduced to nothing too exciting. I retreated to the kitchen, Margaret noticing my distress immediately. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, helping her arrange the next round of appetizers. Just taking it all in. As the evening progressed, I learned more about David's new world. His classmates came from families of senators, federal prosecutors, corporate lawyers. Emma's social circle discussed their spring break plans in Aspen and summer internships at their father's firms. David participated in these conversations with an eagerness that revealed how badly he wanted to belong. When the conversation turned to backgrounds and family connections, I watched my son craft careful responses that painted our modest upbringing in vague terms. He spoke about growing up in a small town, rather than the trailer park we had called home during his elementary years. He mentioned my government position, without revealing that I now sat on the federal bench, presiding over civil rights cases that affected thousands of lives. The realization that David was ashamed of our past, perhaps even our present, settled in my chest like a stone. I understood his desire to fit in, but watching him distance himself from the struggles that had shaped both of us felt like a betrayal of everything we had overcome together. Margaret touched my arm gently. "Whatever's bothering you, Sugar, remember that some people spend so much time looking up that they forget where they came from. doesn't mean they don't love where they started. Her kindness made the pain more bearable, but it couldn't erase the sting of watching my son choose comfort over truth. As the evening wore on, Richard Sterling's voice grew louder and more commanding with each glass of wine. I continued serving appetizers, becoming an invisible witness to conversations that revealed the true character of David's new social circle. Richard held court near the main bar, surrounded by other wealthy parents who hung on his every word. His stories alternated between business conquests and complaints about the decline of society, peppered with barely disguised prejudice that made my skin crawl. The problem with this country, he declared, gesturing broadly with his wine glass, is that we've lost respect for natural hierarchy. Everyone thinks they deserve the same opportunities regardless of their background or breeding. A woman in an expensive pearl necklace nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely, Richard. Standards have simply disappeared. Look at who they're admitting to these universities now. I refilled their drinks, my hands steady, despite the rage building inside me. Richard continued his monologue, apparently emboldened by the agreement around him. Take the service industry, for example. These people, he said, waving dismissively in my general direction without actually looking at me, they have no concept of boundaries or appropriate behavior. Last month, I had to have security remove a housekeeper from our country club because she was using the member facilities. Can you imagine the audacity? His audience murmured sympathetic sounds, treating his story as evidence of societal breakdown, rather than human dignity seeking basic respect. Through the crowd, I spotted David laughing at something Emma had said, his face bright with happiness. But when Richard's voice carried across the room with another disparaging comment about certain types of people, I watched my son's expression falter momentarily before he forced his smile back into place. Emma, to her credit, looked uncomfortable with her father's increasingly offensive remarks. She tugged on his sleeve at one point, whispering something that made him wave her away impatiently. Emma's too soft-hearted, Richard explained to his audience. She doesn't understand that compassion without boundaries becomes weakness. That's why she needs someone like David to ground her. Good family-appropriate background understands the importance of maintaining standards. The irony was suffocating. Richard praised David for qualities that were complete fabrications, built on assumptions about our background that couldn't have been further from the truth. If he knew that David's mother had grown up in foster care, had worked multiple minimum wage jobs to pay for community college, had fought every single day to pull herself out of poverty through sheer determination, would he still consider our family appropriate? Margaret appeared at my elbow with a concerned expression. That man's been getting nastier all night. His type always does when they get liquored up and feel safe with their own kind. She wasn't the only one who had noticed. The other kitchen staff had been exchanging worried glances as Richard's comments grew more pointed. Maria, a young woman who spoke with a slight accent, had been specifically avoiding the dining room after overhearing Richard's complaints about foreign workers taking American jobs. "I've been doing this for 15 years," Margaret continued quietly, "and I can always tell which events are going to get ugly. The fancier the party, the nastier they get when they think we can't hear them." As if summoned by our conversation, Richard's voice rose again, this time focused specifically on the catering staff. "And look at this setup," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen area. "I specifically asked the university to ensure appropriate staffing for tonight. This is a celebration of academic achievement, not some community outreach program." The event coordinator, a nervous young woman with a clipboard, hurried over to Richard with an apologetic smile. "Is there a problem with the service, Mr. Sterling?" "Indeed there is." Richard pointed directly at me as I emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh tray of appetizers. "That woman has been hovering around the reception all evening. I don't know what her story is, but she doesn't belong in the main dining area with the families." Every eye in the vicinity turned to me, and I felt the familiar sensation of being reduced to a stereotype, judged entirely on appearance and assumption. The event coordinator's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized she was being asked to discriminate against someone based purely on Richard's prejudices. Sir, she's part of our catering team. She's supposed to be serving in the dining area. Then get her a proper uniform and train her how to behave around decent people. Better yet, keep her in the kitchen where she belongs. Emma's face went pale and she grabbed her father's arm more forcefully this time. Dad, please, you're being inappropriate. I'm being practical, sweetheart. There are standards to maintain. David, who had been standing close enough to hear the entire exchange, said nothing. He stood frozen, his face, a mask of internal conflict, watching his girlfriend's father openly demean the woman serving their food, the woman who had raised him, sacrificed for him, and loved him unconditionally. I met his eyes across the room, silently pleading for some sign of recognition, some acknowledgement that this was wrong. Instead, David looked away and began an animated conversation with another student about their upcoming finals. The betrayal was complete. Not only was my son allowing me to be humiliated, but he was actively participating in his own mother's degradation through silence and avoidance. Margaret had witnessed the entire exchange from the kitchen doorway. When I returned to refill my tray, she pulled me aside with fierce protectiveness. Don't you let that man's ignorance get to you. I've seen his type before. Born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. The way he treats service workers tells you everything you need to know about his character. Her words provided comfort, but they couldn't heal the deeper wound of watching my son choose social acceptance over basic human decency. The very principles I had tried to instill in him, respect for all people regardless of their circumstances, the dignity of honest work, the importance of standing up for what's right, were being abandoned for the promise of acceptance into Richard Sterling's world. As the evening progressed, Richard's behavior grew even more emboldened. He began making pointed comments about immigration, about people who didn't belong in certain spaces, about the importance of knowing one's place in society. Each remark was a calculated assault on the dignity of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptability. And through it all, David remained silent, complicit in his own mother's humiliation. The evening reached its breaking point when Richard Sterling, emboldened by alcohol and the enthusiastic agreement of his social circle, decided to take direct action against what he perceived as an inappropriate presence at his daughter's celebration. I was in the kitchen helping Margaret prepare the final round of desserts when Richard appeared in the service entrance. His face was flushed with wine and righteous indignation, his expensive suit wrinkled from animated gesturing throughout the evening. "Excuse me," he called out in the slow, exaggerated tone people use when they assume their audience doesn't speak English well. "Which one of you is the supervisor here?" Margaret stepped forward, her posture straightening with the kind of dignity that comes from years of dealing with entitled customers. "I am. Is there something wrong with the service, sir?" Richard pointed directly at me, his finger wavering slightly. "That woman has been disrupting our event all evening. She doesn't understand proper protocol for serving distinguished guests." The accusation was so absurd that several kitchen staff members exchanged incredulous looks. I had been nothing but professional throughout the evening, maintaining the same level of service I had observed from the other workers. "Ma'am." Richard continued directing his attention to me with theatrical patience. "Do you understand English? You need to stay in the kitchen area. No more wandering around the reception." I straightened my spine and met his gaze directly. "I understand English perfectly well, Mr. Sterling. I also understand basic human courtesy, which seems to be in short supply this evening." My clear diction and confident tone caught him off guard, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and growing anger. "Are you being insolent with me? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," I replied calmly. "The question is whether you have any idea who anyone else is." Richard's face darkened with rage at what he perceived as unprecedented disrespect from someone he considered far beneath his station. The alcohol had clearly impaired his judgment because his next actions crossed lines that should have been sacred to anyone with basic human decency. "I don't know how you got hired for this event," he snarled, stepping closer to me, "but I'm going to make sure you never work another university function. In fact, I'm going to call immigration services and have them check your status. I can smell illegal from a mile away." The racist assumption hit the room like a physical slap. The other kitchen workers gasped audibly, and Margaret stepped protectively in front of me. "Sir, you need to leave this area immediately," Margaret said firmly. "You have no right to harass my staff." But Richard was beyond reasoning. He grabbed my arm roughly, his fingers digging into my skin with enough force to leave marks. "Come on," he growled, attempting to drag me toward the exit. "You're leaving right now. Security—" The commotion drew attention from the main reception area. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face horrified as she witnessed her father physically assaulting someone half his size. "Dad, what are you doing? Let her go immediately." "Stay out of this, Emma. This is about maintaining appropriate standards." But the most devastating moment came when David appeared behind Emma, taking in the scene of his girlfriend's father manhandling his own mother. Our eyes met, and I saw the recognition dawn on his face, followed immediately by paralysis. He knew. He finally knew who I was, who he was watching being assaulted and humiliated. And still, he said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a chasm filled with 20 years of love, sacrifice, and shared struggle. In that moment, I watched my son make a choice that would define his character forever. He chose his social advancement over his mother's dignity. Richard continued his tirade, his voice growing louder and more vicious. "People like you think you can infiltrate any space, take any opportunity. You come to this country illegally, then have the audacity to pretend you belong at events like this." His assumptions about my citizenship, my background, my very right to exist in the same space as his family, revealed the depth of his prejudice. But worse than his ignorance was the circle of wealthy parents who watched this abuse without intervention, their silence serving as tacit approval of his behavior. Of his. Margaret and the other kitchen workers had rallied around me, forming a protective barrier against Richard's continued assault. Maria, despite her own fears about drawing attention to herself, stepped forward with remarkable courage. "She doesn't deserve this," Maria said, her accented English carrying more dignity than Richard's native tongue. "No person deserves this." 2 security guards finally appeared, but their hesitation was telling. They looked between Richard Sterling, clearly a person of influence, and me, apparently just a member of the catering staff. The power dynamics were obvious, and their training had prepared them to defer to wealth and status, rather than justice and human decency. "Officers," Richard called out with authority, "please escort this disruptive individual from the premises. She's been causing problems all evening, and I have reason to believe she may not have proper documentation to be in this country." The guards approached uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with the racial profiling, but unsure how to navigate the competing pressures of their job. Through all of this, David remained frozen in the doorway, his face pale with the recognition of his own moral failure. Emma had begun crying, whether from embarrassment at her father's behavior or genuine empathy for my situation, I couldn't tell. The moment crystallized everything I had spent my career fighting against: the assumptions, the prejudices, the casual dehumanization of people who didn't fit certain social categories. But more than that, it revealed the devastating personal cost of those battles when your own child lacks the courage to stand beside you. Richard Sterling had succeeded in reducing me to his stereotype, stripping away my dignity, my accomplishments, my very humanity. And my son had watched it happen without saying a word. The moment had come to stop being a victim and start being a federal judge. I calmly removed the apron that had served as my disguise throughout the evening, folding it neatly and placing it on the kitchen counter. My movements were deliberate and controlled, drawing the attention of everyone in the cramped service area. "Margaret," I said quietly, "would you please gather your staff as witnesses to what just occurred? I believe they'll want to give statements to university officials very shortly." Something in my tone made the security guards pause their approach. The change in my demeanor was unmistakable. The shift from defensive victim to someone accustomed to commanding authority in high-stakes situations. I reached into my purse and withdrew my federal credentials, the leather case worn smooth from years of use in courtrooms across the district. The lead security guard's eyes widened as he read the identification card that identified me as the Honorable Hannah Martinez, United States Federal Judge for the Southern District. "Officer," I said, my voice carrying the same tone I used when addressing attorneys who had tried my patience. "I need you to contact the university president's office immediately. Tell them that Judge Martinez requests an emergency meeting regarding a civil rights incident that occurred at tonight's event." The guard's radio crackled to life as he stepped away to make the call his previous uncertainty, replaced by professional deference. The shift in power dynamics was immediate and unmistakable. Richard Sterling, still flushed with anger and alcohol, hadn't yet grasped the magnitude of his mistake. "I don't care what kind of fake identification she's carrying. I want her removed from these premises immediately." I turned to face him directly, my judicial training taking over completely. "Mr. Sterling, I am United States Federal Judge Hannah Martinez. For the past 2 hours, I have personally witnessed you engage in systematic harassment, racial profiling, and physical assault against a member of this university's catering staff. That staff member happens to be me." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard's face went through a remarkable transformation, from arrogant confidence to confusion to dawning horror, as the implications of his actions began to penetrate his alcohol-clouded consciousness. Emma gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Judge Martinez, you're David's mother." David, still frozen in the doorway, looked like he was watching his entire future collapse in real time. The girlfriend whose father could open doors to prestigious law firms, the social connections that promised easy advancement, the carefully constructed image of appropriate background, all of it crumbling because he had been too ashamed to acknowledge the most accomplished person in his life. "Yes," I replied to Emma with gentle dignity. "I'm David's mother. I raised him alone after his father left when he was 3 years old. I worked my way through law school while supporting us both, and I've spent the last 10 years on the federal bench hearing civil rights cases." Margaret let out a low whistle of amazement. "Girl, you're a federal judge, and you've been in here helping me serve appetizers all night." "Sometimes you learn the most about people when they think nobody important is watching," I replied, echoing my thoughts from the beginning of the evening. The university president's assistant appeared within minutes, followed closely by the president himself and the university's legal counsel. Word was spreading rapidly through the academic staff about the evening's events, and the institutional panic was beginning to set in. Dr. Patricia Whitman, the university president, approached me with the kind of careful respect reserved for federal officials who have the power to destroy institutional funding. "Judge Martinez, I cannot begin to express how mortified we are about tonight's events. Please know that this behavior does not reflect the values of our institution." Richard Sterling, finally beginning to understand the catastrophic nature of his situation, attempted damage control. "There's been a misunderstanding. I had no idea who she was. If she had simply identified herself properly from the beginning—" I held up a hand to silence him, the same gesture I used in my courtroom when attorneys attempted to interrupt proceedings. "Mr. Sterling, the problem is not that you failed to recognize my position. The problem is that you believe anyone deserves to be treated the way you treated me tonight, regardless of their profession or background." The legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman who clearly understood the implications better than anyone else in the room, was already taking notes on everything being said. Emma stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. "Judge Martinez, I am so deeply sorry for my father's behavior. This is inexcusable." "Emma," I said gently, "you have nothing to apologize for. In fact, you were the only member of your family who tried to intervene on my behalf." David finally found his voice, stepping into the kitchen area with his face pale and his hands shaking. "Mom, I don't know what to say." Then perhaps you should start with the truth, I replied, beginning with why you were ashamed to tell your classmates that your mother is a federal judge. The question hung between us like an accusation witnessed by his girlfriend, her father, university officials, and the kitchen staff who had shown me more respect in one evening than my own son had demonstrated in months of phone calls where I was reduced to working in government. Richard Sterling's business associates, having heard whispers of the commotion, began appearing in the service area. Their faces showed the dawning recognition that their colleague had just committed social and legal suicide in the most public way possible. The security guard returned with confirmation from the president's office, speaking in respectful tones that contrasted sharply with his earlier uncertainty. Judge Martinez, Dr. Whitman, has cleared her schedule for an emergency meeting. The conference room has been prepared whenever you're ready. I looked around the kitchen at Margaret and her staff, who had rallied to protect someone they believed was just another working person facing discrimination. Before we proceed with any official meetings, I said, I want to ensure that every member of this catering staff understands that they are protected witnesses to a federal civil rights incident. Their jobs are secure, and any retaliation against them would constitute additional federal violations. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and amazement. In one evening, she had gone from supervisor of an invisible workforce to protected witness in a federal case, with guarantees that her courage in defending a coworker would not cost her the livelihood she desperately needed. The tide had turned completely. Richard Sterling, who had begun the evening as the most powerful person in the room, now stood revealed as a man who had just committed multiple federal violations in front of dozens of witnesses, including the federal judge, who would likely be involved in determining his fate. And David, my son, was finally seeing his mother for who she really was, not someone to be hidden or minimized, but someone whose strength and accomplishments should have been a source of pride rather than shame. The emergency meeting convened in the university's main conference room, a space typically reserved for trustee meetings and ceremonial occasions. The mahogany table reflected the overhead lights, creating an appropriately formal atmosphere for what was about to become the most consequential conversation of Richard Sterling's life. Dr. Whitman sat at the head of the table, flanked by the university's legal counsel and chief of security. I took my place across from Richard Sterling, with Emma seated beside her father, looking increasingly pale as the full scope of the situation became clear. Before we begin, I announced, I want everyone to understand that I am speaking tonight both as someone who was personally victimized by Mr. Sterling's actions and as a federal judge who has witnessed what appears to be systematic civil rights violations. Richard's expensive lawyer, hastily summoned from his home, leaned forward nervously. Your Honor, my client was attending a social function. Any misunderstandings that occurred were simply the result of miscommunication in a chaotic environment. I opened my briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it deliberately on the table, where everyone could see it. The Sterling Properties logo was clearly visible on several documents. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice carrying the same authority I used when presiding over federal cases. I believe you should know that your company, Sterling Properties, is currently the subject of multiple federal investigations that have come across my desk in recent months. The color drained from Richard's face as he recognized the implications of my words. Emma gasped clearly, hearing about her family's legal troubles for the first time. 3 separate civil rights complaints have been filed against Sterling Properties in the past 18 months. I continued opening the folder to reveal meticulously documented evidence. The complaints allege systematic discrimination in housing rentals, employment practices, and vendor selection. All 3 cases specifically cite a pattern of excluding applicants and contractors based on race, ethnicity, and perceived immigration status. Richard's lawyer immediately began damage control. Your Honor, these are merely allegations. My client maintains his innocence and looks forward to defending himself in the appropriate legal forums. Indeed, I replied. And those legal forums happen to be my courtroom. I am the presiding judge assigned to hear Sterling Properties versus the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as the class action lawsuit filed by the Civil Rights Coalition. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Sterling had just spent an entire evening publicly demonstrating the exact same prejudices and discriminatory behavior that were the foundation of the federal cases against his company. More importantly, he had done so in front of the very judge who would be determining his company's fate. Dr. Whitman's legal counsel was furiously taking notes, recognizing that the university had potentially facilitated a federal civil rights violation on its own premises. The institutional liability was staggering. "Your Honor," the university lawyer interjected carefully, "what can we do to address tonight's incident and ensure that nothing like this ever happens again?" I appreciated her direct approach, but my attention remained focused on Richard Sterling, who was beginning to understand the catastrophic nature of his situation. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "the evidence in your federal cases includes sworn affidavits from former employees describing a workplace culture of discrimination that mirrors exactly what I witnessed tonight. Rental applicants have testified about being told that certain types of people weren't appropriate for Sterling Properties. Contractors have described being dismissed from projects when Mr. Sterling deemed them unsuitable based on appearance and assumptions about background." Emma's face crumpled as she realized her family's wealth had been built on systematic exclusion and prejudice. "Dad, is this true? Have you really been discriminating against people?" Richard's attempts at explanation grew increasingly desperate. "Emma, you don't understand business. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions about who fits with your company culture." "Company culture," I repeated. "Is that what you call telling a federal judge that she should be kept away from real guests because of her appearance? Is that what you call physically assaulting someone while threatening to call immigration services based purely on racial profiling?" The university president leaned forward with obvious concern. "Judge Martinez, what legal exposure does the university face for tonight's events?" "That depends," I replied, "on how seriously the institution takes its commitment to civil rights and equal treatment. Mr. Sterling's behavior tonight wasn't just personally offensive. It was a federal civil rights violation that occurred on university property during an official university event." Richard's lawyer was frantically conferring with his client in whispered tones, clearly advising him to remain silent before he made the situation worse. But Richard's ego and alcohol consumption had impaired his judgment beyond redemption. "This is ridiculous," he burst out. "I made some comments that were taken out of context. I had no way of knowing who she was. If she had just identified herself properly instead of playing some kind of game—" I held up my hand to stop him, the same gesture that commanded silence in my federal courtroom. "Mr. Sterling, you have just demonstrated the fundamental problem with your thinking. You believe that how you treat people should depend on their status or position rather than their basic human dignity. Tonight, you physically assaulted someone, made racist assumptions about their citizenship, and attempted to have them removed from a public event based purely on their appearance. The fact that your victim happened to be a federal judge is legally significant, but morally irrelevant. Your behavior would have been equally reprehensible if I had actually been a member of the catering staff." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I can't listen to any more of this. Dad, you've embarrassed our entire family. Judge Martinez, I am profoundly sorry for what you endured tonight." She turned to face her father directly, her voice shaking with emotion and moral conviction. "I'm also sorry that it took seeing you humiliated to make me realize what kind of person you really are. I've been making excuses for your attitudes for years, telling myself you were just old-fashioned or traditional. But tonight showed me the truth about who you are and what our family represents." The personal drama was heartbreaking, but I maintained my judicial focus on the larger issues at stake. "Dr. Whitman," I said, addressing the university president, I want to discuss concrete steps to ensure that tonight's incident leads to meaningful institutional change rather than just damage control. Richard Sterling's business empire, built on decades of discriminatory practices, was about to face the full weight of federal justice. His social standing in the community that had enabled and applauded his prejudices was crumbling in real time. And Emma's courage in confronting her father's behavior demonstrated that even families built on systematic discrimination could produce individuals with the moral clarity to choose justice over comfort. The meeting continued deep into the night, establishing the framework for accountability that would transform not just Sterling Properties, but the university's approach to civil rights and the broader community's understanding of systemic discrimination. Justice, it turned out, was not just about punishment. It was about creating lasting change that would prevent future victims from enduring what I had experienced in that kitchen. Word of the evening's events spread through the reception like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and shocked expressions as the reality of what had occurred began to sink in throughout the academic community. David finally approached me as the formal meeting concluded, his face bearing the weight of profound shame and recognition. The confident young law student who had begun the evening eager to impress his girlfriend's wealthy family now stood before me as someone who had witnessed his own moral failure in the starkest possible terms. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize to you in front of everyone who is here tonight." Without waiting for my response, he walked purposefully toward the main reception area, where the remaining guests had gathered, buzzing with rumors and speculation about the commotion that had disrupted their elegant evening. David approached the podium that had been set up for official remarks and tapped the microphone, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The conversations died away as David's classmates, their parents, and the university faculty turned to listen. "Good evening," David began, his voice shaking but determined. "My name is David Martinez, and I need to address something that happened here tonight." He paused, gathering courage for what was clearly the most difficult speech of his young life. "Earlier this evening, my mother was physically assaulted, racially profiled, and humiliated by someone in this room. The reason this was allowed to happen is because she was mistaken for a member of the catering staff, and the person who attacked her believed that gave him the right to treat her as less than human." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd as David continued. "What makes this even more shameful is that I was present when it happened, and I said nothing. I watched my own mother being degraded and abused, and I chose my social comfort over her dignity." Emma, who had been standing with a group of her classmates, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "I need to tell everyone that my mother is the Honorable Hannah Martinez, United States Federal Judge for the Southern District. She has spent her career fighting for civil rights and equal justice. She raised me alone while working multiple jobs to put herself through law school. She is the most accomplished person I know, and I have been hiding her achievements because I was ashamed of our humble beginnings." The crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful. David's classmates looked stunned as they realized the magnitude of what had occurred. Several professors who recognized my name from legal journals stepped forward with expressions of horror and solidarity. "But here's what I learned tonight." David continued, his voice growing stronger. "My mother's worth as a human being had nothing to do with her professional accomplishments. She deserved basic respect and dignity, whether she was a federal judge or actually a member of the catering staff. The person who attacked her revealed his own character, not hers." Emma made a decision that demonstrated remarkable courage and moral clarity. She approached the microphone as David stepped aside. "I need to add something," she said, her voice clear, despite her tears. "The person who assaulted Judge Martinez tonight was my father, Richard Sterling. I am deeply ashamed of his behavior and the values he represents. I cannot continue a relationship with someone whose mother I respect more than my own father." The personal cost of Emma's moral stance was evident to everyone present. She was choosing principle over privilege, justice over family loyalty, conscience over comfort. David. Emma continued, "You are a good person who made a mistake tonight, but I cannot ask you to be part of a family that built its wealth on the same prejudices my father displayed this evening." The breakup, conducted in front of their entire social circle, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Emma was sacrificing her own happiness to avoid contaminating David with her family's toxic legacy. Margaret and the other kitchen staff had been invited into the main reception area as honored witnesses. The contrast between their quiet dignity and the earlier behavior of the wealthy guests was not lost on anyone present. Dr. Whitman took the microphone to address the gathering formally. "Tonight, our university failed in its most basic obligation to ensure equal treatment and human dignity for all people on our campus. Judge Martinez, we are profoundly grateful that you have agreed to work with us to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." The announcement that followed transformed the evening from a social disaster into a catalyst for institutional change. Effective immediately, the university is establishing the Martinez Civil Rights Initiative, funded by mandatory penalties that will be assessed against Sterling properties as part of their federal settlement. This program will provide full scholarships for the children of service workers and mandatory civil rights training for all university events. Margaret's face lit up with amazement as she realized her children's college dreams had suddenly become possible. The other kitchen staff members who had shown such courage in defending someone they believed was just another working person found themselves recognized as heroes rather than invisible servants. Richard Sterling's business associates, who'd been distancing themselves throughout the evening, now openly repudiated any connection to his company. His social isolation was complete and immediate as the business community recognized the legal and reputational toxicity of association with systematic discrimination. The transformation was remarkable. Richard Sterling, who had begun the evening as the most powerful and respected person in the room, now stood completely alone. His daughter had publicly repudiated him, his business associates had fled, and his social circle had evaporated. Meanwhile, the woman he had tried to eject from the reception had become the most honored guest with university officials, competing to demonstrate their respect and commitment to the values she represented. David approached me as the evening finally concluded, his face showing both relief and continued shame. "Mom, I know I can't undo what happened tonight, but I want you to know that I'm dropping out of consideration for any positions with Sterling Properties. I'm applying for internships with the Public Defender's Office and civil rights organizations." The career pivot represented more than just a change in professional direction. It was David's commitment to aligning his future with the values I had tried to teach him, rather than the social climbing that had led to his moral failure. Emma's decision to transfer to another law school despite the personal and financial costs demonstrated similar moral courage. Rather than accepting the privilege that came with her family's wealth, she chose to build her own path based on merit and conviction. The evening that had begun with my humiliation had transformed into a celebration of human dignity and moral courage. The kitchen staff who had defended a stranger became honored guests. The son who had failed his mother committed to redemption through service. The daughter who confronted her father's prejudices chose principle over privilege. And Richard Sterling, the man who thought wealth and status gave him the right to dehumanize others, learned that true power comes from moral authority, something that cannot be bought, inherited, or stolen. 6 months later, I sat in my federal courtroom presiding over the final hearing in Sterling Properties versus the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The mahogany bench that elevated me above the proceedings felt different now, not just as a symbol of judicial authority, but as a platform for the kind of justice that could transform communities. Richard Sterling sat at the defendant's table, his expensive legal team flanking him as they prepared to accept the comprehensive settlement that would reshape his company and compensate the hundreds of people who had been denied housing and employment opportunities based on discriminatory practices. The evidence presented over months of hearings painted a devastating picture of systematic exclusion. rental applications marked with coded notations that flagged applicants based on surnames, employment interviews that ended abruptly when candidates didn't fit Sterling's narrow vision of appropriate representation, contracting opportunities denied to minority-owned businesses despite superior qualifications. "Mr. Sterling," I said, addressing him directly from the bench, "before I accept this settlement agreement, the court wants to ensure that you understand the full scope of the changes required by this consent decree." His response was a subdued acknowledgement, his earlier arrogance replaced by the recognition that his discriminatory empire was being systematically dismantled under federal oversight. The settlement terms were comprehensive. Sterling Properties would pay $14 million in damages to affected individuals and families. The company would be placed under federal monitoring for 5 years, with every hiring, rental, and contracting decision subject to civil rights compliance review. 25% of all future housing units would be designated as affordable housing for working families. But the most meaningful aspect of the settlement was the establishment of the Martinez Civil Rights Education Center, funded by Sterling Properties and administered by the university. Margaret's daughter, Sarah, had been selected as the center's first scholarship recipient, beginning her journey toward law school with the full support that had been denied to her mother's generation. The personal transformations that grew from that terrible evening at the law school reception had been equally profound. David was completing his second semester as an intern with the Southern Poverty Law Center, working on voting rights cases that challenged the very system of privilege he had once sought to join. His relationship with Emma had evolved into something deeper than their original romance. After transferring to a public interest law program, Emma had dedicated herself to housing rights advocacy, specifically focusing on combating the discriminatory practices her family's company had perpetuated. Their shared commitment to justice had created a bond stronger than their initial attraction. Margaret had become a powerful voice in the civil rights training programs, now mandatory at universities across the state. Her testimony about the dignity of service work and the importance of treating all people with respect had moved audiences from college students to corporate executives. When Judge Martinez stood up for herself that night, Margaret often told her audiences she wasn't just defending her own dignity. She was defending every single person who has ever been judged by their appearance, their job, or their background instead of their character and humanity. The ripple effects of that evening had extended far beyond individual lives. The university had become a model for inclusive events and worker treatment, with its policies being adopted by institutions across the country. The Martinez Civil Rights Initiative had expanded beyond scholarships to include comprehensive bias training, community outreach programs, and research into systemic discrimination. Emma's courage in confronting her father and choosing principle over privilege had inspired other young people from wealthy families to examine their own advantages and responsibilities. She had become a sought-after speaker at law schools, sharing her story about the moral awakening that led her to reject inherited prejudice in favor of earned justice. Richard Sterling's social and business isolation had been complete and permanent. His former associates had not just distanced themselves from his discriminatory practices, but had actively worked to demonstrate their own commitment to civil rights to avoid being tarred with the same brush. The business community's rejection of his values had sent a clear message that systematic discrimination was not just morally wrong, but economically and socially toxic. As I concluded the final hearing, I reflected on the lesson that had emerged from that painful evening 6 months earlier. The most important battles for justice often begin in the smallest moments. When someone chooses to speak up rather than remain silent, when someone decides to act rather than accept the status quo, when someone recognizes that their own comfort is less important than another person's dignity. The court finds that the proposed settlement adequately addresses the violations documented in this case, I announced, However, I want to emphasize that the work of building a just society cannot be completed through legal decisions alone. It requires the daily commitment of individuals who choose to see the humanity in every person they encounter. I looked out at the packed courtroom where Margaret sat with her daughter David and Emma together in the front row, and dozens of community members who had been affected by Sterling's discriminatory practices. Justice is not a destination, I continued. It is a journey that requires constant vigilance, moral courage, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good. The events that brought this case to my courtroom began with one person's decision to remain silent when they witnessed injustice. They were transformed when that same person chose to speak up and take action. The gavel that concluded the hearing felt like more than the end of a legal case. It was the affirmation of a principle that had guided my entire career, that the law at its best is not just about punishment or compensation, but about creating the conditions for human dignity to flourish. After the hearing, I joined Margaret, David, Emma, and the other community members who had gathered to celebrate not just the legal victory, but the human transformation that had made it possible. The conversation that evening was different from the reception where our story began. Instead of exclusion and discrimination, there was inclusion and mutual respect. Instead of judgment based on appearance or assumptions, there was recognition of each person's inherent worth. Margaret's words captured the essence of what we had all learned. That night in the kitchen, I thought we were just defending another working person from unfair treatment. I never imagined we were participating in something that would change so many lives. But I guess that's how real change always happens. It starts when ordinary people decide to do the right thing even when it's difficult. The lesson of that evening had become clear through months of reflection and action. True strength comes not from the power to dominate or exclude others, but from the courage to include and uplift them. Real success is measured not by what we can take from others, but by what we can contribute to the common good. And the most important judgment we face is not from courts or institutions, but from our own consciences, when we look in the mirror and ask whether we used our advantages to build bridges or walls, to create opportunity, or maintain exclusion, to stand up for justice, or remain complicit in injustice. The story that began with my humiliation in a university kitchen had become a testament to the power of moral courage and the possibility of redemption. It proved that even the most painful experiences can become catalysts for positive change when people choose to respond with integrity rather than bitterness with action, rather than acceptance with hope, rather than despair. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the fight for human dignity is never finished, but it can be won one person, one moment, and one choice at a time. Have you ever witnessed discrimination or injustice in your workplace, school, or community? What did you do in that moment, and what do you wish you had done differently? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their courage when it matters most. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of justice and redemption, and share it with others who need to hear this message. Thank you for listening, and remember, you have the power to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. May your courage make a difference in someone's life today.